Hello, everyone, and welcome to an EAS Consulting Group webinar. My name is Jessica Lloyd, Marketing Communications Coordinator, and I'll be your host for today's presentation. Please join me in welcoming today's presenters, Dean Cirotta and Shelley Blackwell. EAS Consulting Group President Dean Cirotta is a highly accomplished executive in the pharmaceutical and dietary supplement industries, including executive management roles overseeing regulatory affairs, compliance, quality assurance and control, operations, manufacturing, laboratory operations, and financial and corporate management. He has been actively involved in tobacco regulatory requirements for over 13 years, expanding EAS client services and cementing EAS's reputation in the tobacco industry through the assessment and implementation of quality systems in preparation for FDA inspections and the anticipated TPMPs, and supporting clients in hosting and managing FDA inspections. Shelley Blackwell brings over 22 years of quality and compliance experience in highly regulated environments to EAS Consulting Group as Senior Director for Dietary Supplement and Tobacco Services. After starting her career as a microbiologist, she gained expert knowledge of a variety of domestic and international regulations while holding senior leadership positions in the dietary supplement, pharmaceutical, and medical device industries, including 7 years as the Quality Assurance Director for GNC Nutri Manufacturing, and most recently leading the Quality Systems and Compliance team at Bausch & Lomb in Greenville, South Carolina. Today's webinar is an introduction to the FDA's proposed tobacco product manufacturing practices. Long anticipated by the tobacco manufacturing industry, the FDA has proposed the establishment of TPMPs for finished and bulk tobacco products. The proposed rule, if finalized, would set forth the requirements with which finished and bulk tobacco product manufacturers must comply in the manufacture, pre-production, design, validation, packing and labeling, and storage and distribution of finished and bulk tobacco products. EAS Consulting Group has a long history of CGMP support for FDA-regulated industries, including helping the tobacco industry prepare for the establishment of TPMPs and managing FDA inspections. To ensure your team is ready for these requirements, EAS Consulting Group is available to help navigate key components of what the FDA is proposing. Our team will address any questions as time allows after the presentation. Please submit questions using the Zoom Q&A feature. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available following the presentation. Thank you again for joining us today. And with that, I'll hand it over to Dean and Shelley.
Thank you, Jessica. Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. We appreciate it. For those of you who've been in the tobacco industry for a while, this has been a long time coming. We've been talking about GMPs and now TPMPs since about 2011. So this proposed regulation is about 296 pages. I've been through it twice, and obviously with an hour, we are not going to be able to cover all the details, but we've tried to put together a presentation that kind of hits the highlights, talks about some of the interesting things that the FDA has included in there, just to give everybody something to think about. As you know, comment period is open, and we highly recommend that if these proposed regulations affect you, that you read them carefully and submit concerns or questions and comments to the FDA for their consideration. And then as we learn more through the hearing in a couple of weeks, and then through the publication of the different additional information, we'll keep everybody up to date. So let's kind of go through this at a high level and just give everybody an introduction to what the FDA has proposed. I'm going to start with some background information and some authority and some applicability, and then I'm going to turn it over to Shelley, and she's going to go through the subparts. And then I'm going to close with a few slides on, how does this compare to what was submitted by the industry and what we kind of expected, and then we'll take questions. So the FDA's made it very clear that their intention of these regulations is to ensure that tobacco products conform to established specs, prevent manufacturers and distributors from sending out contaminated or other non-conforming products. And again, all of this under the guys that we are protecting public health. And so that's the way they've written these. And if you read through the preamble to the proposed regs, they mention this many times. They also remind everybody that of their legal authority. As we know, there is the Tobacco Control Act that was signed in 2009. Within that, in section 906, it specifically talked about that the FDA will propose GMPs, and it talked about various GMPs in that. If you read this definition, it talks about methods and facilities and controls, which we see in all the GMPs. But then it talks about pre-production design validation, which is more of a device terminology. And then it even talks about HACCP and other good manufacturing practices, which also refer to the food. So we'll talk about this a little bit more, but they really took all the current regulations into account. They also refer to sections 902 and 903 on related to adulterated and misbranded tobacco, and also their authorities related to records and reports under various sections of the Act. So they clearly have the authority to issue these and to enforce them. I thought it was interesting that they did do a summary of all the things they considered, in that they looked at all the traditional GMPs that we are all familiar with for foods, drugs, dietary supplements, also under Part 820 for medical devices, and on the HACCP and food regulations under 117 for food. So they did take into account everything they've issued in the past. It was interesting that they also mentioned they took some voluntary quality systems into account, the American E-Liquid Manufacturer Standards Association's voluntary standards, and also ISO. And so those you can see that, especially the ISO, you can see that in the proposed regs. And then finally, they've been working with the tobacco industry for many years. Many of us on this call probably have been involved in various facility visits, inspections, and it looks like they've taken a lot of those things into account. If you've been involved in any of these FDA inspections, or you can see a lot of the things that they have asked for over the years, a lot of the things they've reviewed and looked at while they're on site are definitely included in the proposed regs. So how are they planning to apply the rule? They plan to apply it to all manufacturers of finished and bulk tobacco products. What is interesting is they made it very clear, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in a minute, that it applies to both foreign and domestic manufacturers. And it includes both the original traditional products that were included under the Tobacco Act and the deemed products. So cigarettes, roll your own, smokeless tobacco, but then also ends, e-liquids, hookah, cigars, gels, and all the next gen type products. A tobacco product manufacturer is clearly defined. It's any person, including repackers and relabelers, who manufacture, fabricate, assemble, process, or label a tobacco product, or imports a finished or bulk tobacco product for sale or distribution in the United States. So again, they're bringing our foreign colleagues into this if they're going to import products into the United States. This also included specification developers. And Shelley will talk about this a little bit more, but these are the folks that may just do design work for each of you and not actually have anything to do with manufacturing. And then I thought it was interesting that the FDA also stated that they do not propose to include third-party laboratories. However, as Shelley will talk later, they clearly have put the responsibility on the manufacturers to ensure that their third-party labs comply with all the requirements of the proposed regulation. And as we've seen in the past, it will apply to components, but it will not apply to accessories. So just a little bit more, and again, these are right from the proposed regs. It does give the FDA authority to refuse admission of tobacco products imported or offered for sale in the United States if they've been manufactured, processed, or packed under insanitary conditions. They also talked about if it's illegal in the country from which they are being exported, and if they are adulterated and misbranded. And those of us who've been in the GMP world for a long time know that adulterated doesn't mean that it is either been contaminated or is poisonous or anything. The fact that it does not comply with GMPs means that it is adulterated. And they clearly stated that a product will be adulterated if a manufacturer fails to comply with the requirements of the proposed TPMPs. The FDA also has made it clear that they're proposing these TPMPs to prevent product problems, as well as health issues that are not normally associated with the use of tobacco products. So we all know that there are many health issues that are commonly known that are from the use of tobacco products, but the proposed guidance also talks about the manufacturer's responsibility to look for those things that may not normally be associated, and that'll all have to be dealt with under how you do complaints and complaint investigations. This also will apply to vape shops, and there's a section in there on that. I've just included a few of the references, but simply selling products would not constitute a vape shop from being a finished or bulk tobacco manufacturer. So if you just sell a product, you will not have to comply to this. But many of these shops, as we know, mix or prepare their own proprietary e-liquids. They also build apparatuses. They modify apparatuses for their clients, and that would bring them under the definition of a manufacturer, and they would have to comply with these proposed TPMPs. But it also goes on to say that they would only have to comply with the requirements that are applicable to their operation. So if they are only doing parts of the TPMPs, then they only have to comply with those certain sections. The FDA has also talked about pre-existing products. So even though pre-existing products are not considered new tobacco products under the Act, those new products are still subject to the provisions of the TPMPs. The FDA basically feels this will help manufacturers ensure that pre-existing products are manufactured to their original spec and do not undergo any modifications, because as we all know, under the Tobacco Act, the definition of changes and what's a new tobacco product is very broad. And the FDA wants to ensure that any changes or modifications you've made do not create a new tobacco product that would not be approved under your application. It's also going to help the FDA understand if you've made any changes to your established specs, your manufacturing methods, or your product, again, rendering it a new tobacco product, which they are very concerned about. They want to make sure that each applicant continues to manufacture the product as it is was permitted in their marketing order. The TPMPs also, they felt like would help them assure compliance with the other requirements within the Act, such as your requirement for listing of ingredients, additives, HPHCs. So with TPMP, with all the documentation required under TPMPs, they'll be able to check these things. The record keeping requirements with the MMR and batch production records, again, will allow them to see that your ingredients are consistent with your applications. They'll be able to see your labels, because there is a section in the TPMPs that talks about labeling. So they'll be able to ensure that the labeling matches what was submitted. They will also be able to make sure that that everything else that's in your application matches what's documented in the TPMPs. And they also feel that obviously these TPMPs will put in controls and risk management requirements that will prevent the product from being contaminated. It is important, though, to understand that not everybody doesn't have to comply with all of the requirements under the TPMP. So they've made it clear that manufacturers need only comply with those requirements applicable to your operation. And they gave some examples. So for example, if a manufacturer of a finished e-liquid would not need to comply with warning plans because e-liquids are only required to bear a single warning, and they do not have the rotational warning plans that we see with traditional cigarettes. If somebody is only engaged in repackaging and relabeling, they would only need to be required to comply with those sections of the TPMPs, including things like buildings and sanitary conditions and environmental controls. And then I mentioned earlier, and again, Shelley will talk about this, specification developers. So people that are only designing, creating specifications, and helping a company develop a new product, they would not have to deal with the MMRs and the buildings and the facilities and things like that, but focus more on production process controls and potentially handling requirements. So again, we'll have to look at what do they do and what sections of the TPMPs apply to them. And then Shelley will also be talking about which comes in the last sections of the TPMPs. If a manufacturer feels that a requirement is not appropriate or it's not necessary to ensure the public health regarding the tobacco product and how it complies with this chapter, they do have the option to petition for an exemption or a variance from the regulation, and Shelley will go into that in a little bit more detail for us. So what are we going to see here under the proposed regs? It talks about establishing tobacco product design and development controls to minimize certain risks. And there's also quite a bit of discussion about risk assessment and risk mitigation. Ensuring that finished and bulk tobacco products are manufactured in conformance with specifications. Minimizing the likelihood that we distribute non-conforming products. So there's quite a bit in there about how we should handle complaints and non-conforming products and address those through CAPAs. Investigating and requiring identification of non-conforming products or NCPs. Doing investigations, potentially having to initiate recalls, and then establishing traceability. So we already have these types of things in the other GMPs where we need to be able to track all of our parts, ingredients, and additives through documentation into our finished product, so that if we do get a complaint or a potential adverse event, we can investigate it, see where the root cause is, where that potential material went, and how much we would need to recall. So again, these proposed regs would establish these requirements for all these manufacturing activities, treating how we would treat contaminated and otherwise non-conforming products. And again, it's going to include the investigation, evaluation, and corrective action plans, all under the goal of protecting public health. So I'm just briefly going to go over these, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Shelley. She's going to go through these in more detail, but these look like traditional GMPs, nothing really much different. We have our general provisions. Then we go into our management and systems where we talk about organization and complaints. Then the traditional buildings, facilities, and equipment. Then this is where we get a little bit more device focused with design and development controls, and then process controls, including things like purchasing and acceptance activities. There's a section on packaging and labeling, as I mentioned, traditional handling, storage, and distribution. And then, of course, we can't emphasize enough, and it is talked about in each of the subparts. All of this requires detailed documents, record keeping, and how long these documents have to be stored, how they have to be readily available. And so in traditional and true GMP requirements, everything must be documented. If it was not documented, it did not happen or it does not exist. And so a big focus of implementing these will be how you document all of this and prove that you are meeting these requirements. Also, as I mentioned, there's a section on small tobacco product manufacturers, and then also the exemptions and variants requests that the FDA will accept, and how you do that and how the FDA will handle that and the timing of all that, Shelley will go into in more detail. So with that said, I'm going to stop here and turn it over to Shelley, and she is going to go through each of these sections in a little bit more detail to give us an idea of what the FDA is contemplating.
Thank you, Dean, and thanks for the introduction, Jessica. As Jessica mentioned, I spent about 22 years in industry prior to joining EAS, including when the dietary supplement GMPs were proposed and implemented. So I understand the excitement something like this generates. As Dean mentioned, the proposed regulation is divided into 10 subparts. This is similar to other industries. The drug GMPs have 11. So there's some unique aspects here, but a lot of this is what we see in a typical GMP regulation. So Dean spoke a lot about this, but subpart A is mostly focused on scope and applicability of the regulation. It does apply to both foreign and domestic manufacturers. It would define a tobacco product manufacturer as any person, including a repacker or relabeler who manufactures, fabricates, assembles, processes, or labels a tobacco product, or imports it.
This is Dean. I don't believe we can see your slides.
Okay, hang on. Have you stopped sharing?
Yes.
Okay, let me try this one more time. How about now?
Yeah, can you see 21? Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, you just missed me talking. So sorry. The general provision section speaks to scope and applicability. It defines tobacco product manufacturer as any person who repacks, relabels, manufactures, fabricates, assembles, processes, or labels a tobacco product. And this is specifically for sale or distribution in the US, although as Dean mentioned, it does apply to foreign manufacturers. And then, interesting, they point out that the manufacturer of a tobacco product includes establishing the specifications for the tobacco product. They go on to propose specific definitions for finished tobacco product. It does include components or parts that are sealed in the final packaging. And the finished product package is defined as a pack, box, carton, or container. It would include wrapping, such as cellophane, if that's the way that the finished product was offered for sale. It includes components, as we've mentioned, or parts of tobacco products if they're sealed in the final package. The proposed definition of bulk tobacco product is any tobacco product not sealed in final packaging, but still suitable as is for consumer use. So these would be things like bulk cigarettes, bulk pipe tobacco. It also includes components or parts that are not sealed in the final package, but if they are suitable for use as is. And they go on to define suitability, but it can be suitable for a consumer even if it could undergo additional processing. So an example here would be if you have a coconut and pineapple e-liquid that could be used individually on their own, not sealed in final packaging, even if it's possible that they could be blended to produce something like a pina colada e-liquid. It applies to manufacturers of finished or bulk products for general consumer use that meet the definition of finished or bulk product, including the bulk components or parts. And this is a point of interest. It applies to manufacturers of finished or bulk batteries who intend them to be used in an ENDS device. It applies to manufacturers of finished or bulk food grade flavors if those flavors are intended to be used with e-liquids. And then, an example of something like a screen that's sold at a hardware store for a variety of uses, if the manufacturer labels that screen as used to be used with a tobacco product such as an ENDS or co-packages the screen, it would be in scope. The proposed regulation does include components. So it would include finished and bulk components or parts of tobacco products. And these definitions are consistent with the deeming rule. So accordingly, a component or part would mean any software or assembly of materials intended or reasonably expected to either alter or affect the tobacco product's performance, or to be used with or for human consumption of a tobacco product. I'll go on to further explain this, but it does not include accessories of tobacco products. It includes manufacturers of finished and bulk components or parts of tobacco products. So this includes manufacturers of finished or bulk, things like papers, filters, ends, e-liquids, as we mentioned, batteries, and manufacturers of finished or bulk food grade flavors if they're intended to be used with e-liquids. And then we mentioned the example of the screen sold at a hardware store if it's labeled for use with a tobacco product. And just to note, this doesn't reach manufacturers of components or parts if they're not offered for sale, sold, or otherwise distributed to consumers. So it wouldn't apply to manufacturers of things like cigarette tipping paper that are used to manufacture a cigarette but not sold directly to consumers. As we mentioned, it does not include accessories. So the accessories are defined as any product that is intended or reasonably expected to be used with or for the human consumption of a tobacco product, but does not contain tobacco and is not made or derived from tobacco and meets either of the following requirements: that it's not intended or reasonably expected to affect or alter the performance, composition, constituents, or characteristics of a tobacco product, or it's intended or reasonably expected to, is not intended to reasonably affect or maintain the performance, composition, constituents, or characteristics of a tobacco product. So these are things like ashtrays, spittoons, cigar clips, stands, humidors. These would be out of scope. The proposed regulation will not reach manufacturers of components or parts that are not offered for sale, sold, or otherwise distributed. And it would not, as we mentioned, would not apply to manufacturers of things like filter tow paper or cigarette tipping paper that are intended to be used to manufacture a cigarette, but not directly sold to consumers. So this section of the regulation goes into a lot of detail on applicability. We're just highlighting some of the most pertinent parts. So once you move on from scope and applicability, you get into some of the sections that would be considered kind of typical GMPs. And Dean highlighted these. I'm just going to mention some of the parts that stood out to us. Management system is divided into organization and personnel, which says you need to have an organizational structure, have sufficient personnel. I think the most important thing to note here is that manufacturers would be required to specifically designate personnel who are management with executive responsibility. Obviously, the personnel need to be trained, and as Dean mentioned, each of these sections require that you maintain records of these activities. You need to have records that confirm you comply with this regulation. There's a complaint section that requires establishment and maintenance of complaint handling procedures. Interesting, there is a specific corrective and preventive action section, and it's a pretty robust CAPA section. It requires that there are procedures for implementing CAPA, but also that there's procedures for confirming effectiveness of CAPA. Buildings, facilities, and equipment focus a lot on the structure in which the product is manufactured being suitable, of size, and in a way that contamination is mitigated. So personnel practices requires procedures related to mostly things like gowning and having personnel health and sickness policies to reduce risk of contamination. The buildings, facilities, and grounds section requires suitable construction and design to facilitate cleaning. It requires control over the water if it's used in the manufacturing process, adequate lighting and HVAC, and then throughout, proper cleaning and sanitization and animal and pest control are specifically called out. The equipment section requires design, construction, and maintenance procedures. It also requires calibration for certain types of equipment. This is mostly around the testing and measuring equipment. And again, adequate cleaning to prevent cross-contamination. You will see that throughout this regulation. There's an environmental control section. Requires environmental control to be maintained and monitored, and that the necessary equipment is adequate and functioning properly. And again, as I mentioned, I won't repeat this for every section, but you need to have records confirming compliance with the reg. This is a pretty unique section. Dean mentioned similar to the medical device requirement around design and development controls. It's a pretty robust section of this reg. It requires procedures for design and development, but they also speak a lot of risk management. So they go so far as to say you need to use recognized tools for risk management. So this includes very structured approach to analyzing risk and taking appropriate measures to reduce or eliminate risk. It also requires design, verification, and validation. And then, procedures and records around all of this. As Dean mentioned, some of the regs don't apply to existing tobacco products that were already commercially available. So they are not requiring retrospective design verification for products that were already on the market. However, you would be required to do certain design change control aspects. So if there are changes made after the regulation becomes effective, design change control would apply. There's a master manufacturing record. So, this is abbreviated as MMR, but it requires manufacturers to establish and maintain an MMR for each tobacco product. And this includes, as Dean mentioned, the tobacco product specifications. It also includes packaging and label requirements, and a requirement for review and approval of the MMR, and then again, any changes after initial approval. Subpart E process control is the media section of this reg, as similar with other industries. Purchasing controls requires procedures for ensuring purchased or other products meet specifications, but also that the suppliers themselves are qualified. And this section would apply to contract laboratories. The acceptance activities section requires manufacturers to establish and maintain procedures for incoming, in-process, and final acceptance activities. And requires procedures that ensure finished products meet established specifications. And then, a unique part, I believe, about this may be unexpected in some aspects. It does note that once the tobacco product manufacturer accepts an incoming product for use, a unique identifier needs to be assigned. The production process and controls section requires procedures, including process specifications, process controls. They highlight process validation and manual methods for manufacturing and incoming materials. It also requires investigations into any deviations. And so I believe in this case, if you had a deviation to your master manufacturing record, it would need to be investigated and affected product would need to be dispositioned. The laboratory controls section would require finish and bulk product manufacturers to demonstrate, and this is, where Dean pointed out earlier, this applies to both an in-house laboratory or a contract laboratory, that they are competent to perform laboratory activities. So the implication here is that contract laboratories are qualified, as mentioned in the purchasing controls section. It also requires establishment and maintenance of laboratory control procedures. And if a finished or bulk product manufacturer outsources the lab testing, as we mentioned, the manufacturer is required to use those qualification requirements and apply them to the contract laboratory. The production record section, so if you're familiar with GMPs in other industries, this is oftentimes referred to as a BPR, a batch production record. It essentially requires procedures to confirm that when you actually manufacture the batch, it is done so in accordance with the master manufacturing record. And there needs to be documentation of each batch manufacturer. The sampling section requires finished and bulk tobacco products to maintain adequate sampling plan that uses a representative sample based on valid scientific rationale anytime sampling is required under this regulation. Continuing on with process controls, non-conforming products are specifically called out. So this requires procedure for control and disposition. And this is a formal documented process that requires approval anytime specific requirements aren't met. It would also require an investigation, disposition, and follow-up. And specifically, if a specification is not met, the manufacturer needs to investigate the OOS test result to determine if it is a true OOS or due to something else like laboratory error. And again, any affected product here would need to be dispositioned. There is a returned tobacco product section under the proposed rule. It requires procedures for control and disposition of returned tobacco product. And similar requirements exist or would exist under the proposed rule for reprocessing and rework. So if there is product that needs to be reworked or reprocessed, there needs to be a formal process, procedures around it, disposition, and then a final confirmation that the MMR specifications are achieved. Packaging and labeling controls requires manufacturers to establish procedures to ensure the correct packaging and labeling is used to prevent mix-ups. It also requires the packaging and labeling to conform to the MMR and also be approved. All the other applicable requirements would apply here to the labeling. And then of note, the section requires that the labels are indelibly printed or permanently affixed so they don't deteriorate over time. And then also confirmation that the packaging and labeling themselves do not contaminate the product, which could deem it adulterated or misbranded. And then, as with every section, you need procedures and records to confirm. Manufacturing code section, this was a bit unique. It does require a manufacturing code. This can sometimes be referred to as a lot number or a batch number, but it also specifically outlines the manufacturing date format. So they have an MMDDYY format specifically identified that must be printed along with the finished tobacco batch number. And then warning plan section would require manufacturers that are required to comply with a warning plan to establish and maintain procedures for the implementation of such plan. Handling, storage, and distribution section is pretty standard. It requires that the product is stored in a way that prevents mix-up or deterioration, contamination, or adulteration. So this, would definitely apply if there are warehouses or distribution centers that are storing product prior to distribution. And then the distribution section requires that manufacturers establish procedures to ensure that tobacco products are distributed to the initial consignee under appropriate conditions. And notably that the finished product is approved for release prior to distribution. So, as Dean mentioned the phrase, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. That's FDA's view. So not only do they reiterate in each subpart that you need to keep records, they also have a record keeping and document controls section. It requires that basically any document that is used to confirm compliance to the proposed regulation be maintained in a manner such that it is readily accessible to either responsible individuals of the manufacturer, but also to the FDA should they arrive for an inspection. And then the documents and records need to be in English, or an English translation needs to be available. The documents and records required that are associated with a batch of finished or bulk tobacco need to be retained for a period of not less than 4 years from the date of distribution, or until the product reaches its expiration date if the product has one, whichever is later. Documents and records required under this section that are not associated with a batch of finished or bulk tobacco must be retained for a period of not less than 4 years from the date they were last in effect. So these would be records that show things maybe associated with a piece of equipment that is required under the regulation. They need to be maintained for 4 years from the date they were last in effect. Going on, the FDA wants to ensure that these records are accessible to them during a retention period, and then also for inspection and photocopying if needed. And then this was very interesting to me. They highlight that records need to be attributable, legible, contemporaneously recorded, original, and accurate. And this phrase here is an acronym. The acronym is ALCOA. It is an acronym that is used by the FDA specifically around data integrity requirements. So it is of note that they put this specifically called out in this proposed regulation. Most of the ALCOA acronym definitions are probably obvious, but we want to highlight contemporaneously recorded. This is a very important point to the FDA. Contemporaneously recorded means that documentation needs to occur at the time of occurrence. So no predating of records, no post-dating of records, where there is a requirement, for example, in the master manufacturing record that you perform a check, say on an hourly basis, the results of that check need to be recorded at the time the check occurs. And then another thing to note, all electronic records, so if there is an electronic record that is used to achieve compliance to this proposed regulation, it is subject to Part 11. And Part 11 is the part of the CFR that refers to electronic records and electronic signatures. Subpart I specifically talks about small tobacco product manufacturers, and it explains that a small tobacco product manufacturer has 4 years after effective date of the final rule. So we'll go into a little bit more about implementation requirements here in a bit. And as Dean mentioned, there is an exemption and variance section. So there's 5 sections. It sets forth proposed procedures and requirements for petitioning an exemption or variance from this TPMP requirement. It establishes that a petition for an exemption or variance may be referred to the Tobacco Products Scientific Advisory Committee, and it describes how FDA would make a determination on that petition. It notes that FDA would either grant or deny a petition within 60 days after the date the complete petition was submitted to the FDA, or within 60 days after the FDA refers it to the TPSAC. And then the 60-day review period begins when the FDA receives a complete petition. It provides that a petitioner has an opportunity for a hearing after the issuance of an order denying or approving the petition for an exemption or variance. And then I'll just briefly cover the effective date requirements. Dean mentioned the hearing that will occur in April, and he'll highlight some more aspects surrounding what isn't included in the TPMPs and what was and wasn't accepted from industry's perspective. But any final rule with the FDA becomes effective 2 years after the date the final rule is published in the Federal Register. So those manufacturers meeting the definition of a small tobacco product manufacturer, and the FDA defines that as a manufacturer with less than 350 employees, they will have an additional 4 years to come into compliance. So that would give small tobacco product manufacturers a total of 6 years to comply with the TPMP regulations. So you've heard enough of me talk here for a while. Dean, I will turn this back over to you. Let's see. I think I've stopped sharing, so you should be good.
Okay, can we see my screen again, Shelley?
You just need to go to full screen.
Yeah, you got to pop it in presenter mode.
I'm sorry?
You just have to pop it in presenter mode. There we go.
You're good.
Okay, so just a reminder, the Q&A section is available, and any questions we'll try to answer at the end. But I thought it would be interesting for those of us who've been involved in this for a long time to just talk about what was not in the TPMPs, how do they compare to what the industry submitted. So I've just got a few more slides on that. So some of the things that we've seen in other GMPs, additional requirements for stability tests to determine appropriate storage conditions for ENDS products was not specifically included. Requirements for reserve samples of e-liquids for each batch or each lot, similar to what we see in dietary supplements and drugs and devices. The FDA here felt like that the documentation that's going to be required to be compliant with the TPMPs is adequate to do the investigations, and that reserve samples were not required. The FDA did, as Shelley mentioned, talk about requiring CAPA and investigations and documentation, but they did stop short of talking about continuous process improvement requirements related to CAPAs. And I thought it was interesting that they don't specifically talk about a quality unit or a quality organization or quality assurance. However, throughout the document, they talk about examples of if quality is going to do this, or if quality, and it says employees responsible. One example is employees responsible for quality assurance could take classes or coursework relevant to their role, auditing the production process, evaluating the final product for conformance to tobacco product specs and other requirements established in the MMR. So I believe the expectation is going to be that we will all have quality assurance and quality control employees, but it doesn't specifically say that everybody has to have a designated quality unit. And so you just have to have people who are responsible for all the requirements and are adequately trained to perform those duties. And there was, as Shelley mentioned, there's a lot of things in there about responsible people, executive management responsibility, org charts, job descriptions, justifications for our responsibilities. So again, a lot of documentation that's still going to be required, and talks about getting all these, what we traditionally consider QA, QC roles, will still have to be completed. And the last section I have on here is really just talking about what do these look like compared to what the industry recommended back in 2012, and then separately in 2017 regarding ENDS. I was involved in the 2012 submission, and a lot of it is very similar as far as personnel and contamination, buildings, facility, equipment, MMRs, non-conforming products, etc. But the FDA felt like that some of these areas were a little lacking, and they've included some what they're calling more robust provisions when it comes to returned products and having procedures for warning plans. They included additional environmental controls. They specifically talk about process validation, laboratory controls, and sampling. They talk about in great detail the design and development activities, is also regarding how we have to record, investigate, and manage complaints and CAPAs and NCPs. This will be quite a bit of extensive work for the industry. For those who don't already have this implemented, it's quite an undertaking to have a very thorough and well-documented complaint CAPA and NCP programs. So there'll be quite a bit of work to implement these appropriately. And then the manufacturing code, that includes the date and the lot number and distribution record requirements, so that we can do traceability of non-conforming products and potentially recalls, were all things the FDA felt like they needed to make a little bit more detailed than were in the original industry recommendations. And then there are some things that the FDA chose not to include. One, the industry originally had mentioned about having separate requirements for traditional tobacco products and ENDS, and the FDA has taken more of an umbrella approach. This shouldn't have been a shock to anybody. We have single GMPs for drugs, single GMPs for devices and dietary supplements. And obviously under all of those, there are multiple types of different products, and yet we still have one GMP. It does not include additional requirements for stability tests to determine storage conditions and expiration dates if you choose not to have an expiration date. It specifically, though it talks about risk analysis and risk mitigation, it doesn't specifically require a HACCP plan for everybody like we have for many of the food products. And again, they chose to take a more device-based risk management approach than a food-based HACCP approach. And it doesn't include requirements for reserve or what we call retained samples of e-liquids for each batch of product. Again, the FDA believes that the proposed documentation and record-keeping requirements will be sufficient to handle any investigations that may be required, whereas on drugs and devices, retains and reserve samples of each finished lot are very common. So just before I get into questions, I just want to remind everybody we're in the comment period. It's 180 days. That ends I think midnight on September 6th. So I urge everybody to read this very carefully. I hope this will help to some degree because again, it's 296 pages, and we just kind of wanted to give everybody some highlights of what's in there. But please, if this affects your business, I would take advantage of the comment period. Get your clarification questions in if you have concerns, if you have disagreements. The FDA obviously will then have to review all those and respond and include those in the preamble to the final published rule. So we're just beginning this journey. These just came out, and so we have a long way to go, and then we have 2 years of implementation, or 2 years to implement them, 6 years for small manufacturers. So quite a long journey ahead of us, but also quite a bit of work to do, and so probably go by faster than we think. We've got a few minutes left, so I'm gonna take a few questions and see, and I'm sorry, these are in the chat. So one question is, what is our read on TPMP rule towards manufacturers of components and parts? I think Shelley addressed that clearly. Components and parts are included in the TPMP if they are in a state that can be sold directly to consumers, even though they might need some additional blending. Those are included, and we did include some of those interesting examples about batteries and screens. If they are sold and labeled for use in ends products, they would be included. So yes, definitely components and parts are included. What are the specification requirements for third-party lab suppliers? Again, as I mentioned at the beginning and Shelley followed up, the third-party labs are not going to be required to, are not included in the definition of manufacturer here, but clearly the requirements or the obligation is on the manufacturer to ensure that if you are using a lab, that they are providing you all the required documentation to meet the GMPs. They are using valid methods or scientifically valid methods, and they are competent to perform their duties that you've hired them. So this gets into supplier qualification and audits and having the documentation to provide to the FDA that you are using labs that are providing you appropriate data. Are IQ, OQ, PQ procedures required for new production and lab equipment? Yeah, so this is an area, it clearly talks about validation and validation requirements, as Shelley mentioned. And so to do an appropriate validation, you are going to have to look at doing, how you do it as far as traditional IQ, OQ, PQ. So that'll be something that you will definitely want to look at as it applies to future products. And what is the last A in CAPA? It's corrective and preventable actions. So that last A is action. So that's what that stands for. If there's no requirement for specific quality organizations, and individuals throughout the organization may be quality employees, how will the companies assure segregation of duties between manufacturing and quality? I think that's a good question, and I think it gets back to how the FDA has said that we have to have job descriptions and documented responsibilities for people, and I think this for employees, and I think this is something that companies are going to have to be very careful of because I think you do want to avoid a conflict of interest, and you don't want your manufacturing person who made the product also releasing their product. From my initial read, there was no discussion about this specifically, and Shelley can jump in here if I'm incorrect as far as conflict of interest, but it all has to do with documenting what each person's role is, what their responsibilities are, and also designating clearly that they are trained and qualified to do those roles. Shelley, you have anything to add to that?
Just that the fact that they specifically called out a requirement for management with executive responsibility, you know, that is a phrase heard throughout the medical device community. I think even if there's not a requirement specifically for a quality unit, that person with executive management responsibility would be expected to have some independence, even if it's not specifically called out. But that phrase comes straight from medical device, and typically that person is, you know, the head of a quality unit. But yeah, I think, Dean, your point was interesting that they decided not to require a quality unit specifically.
And then, Shelley, can you see the questions?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to let you take the next one on how will the requirements. So the next question is, how will the requirements to development tobacco product specifications affect laboratory testing? What tests might be needed to establish these? Because this all gets back to the development section.
Yeah, I mean, these are, you know, they will rely on the specification developer to develop the appropriate test and then limits around the test that ensure that the tobacco product essentially meets the requirements in the MMR. So it will be unique. It won't be a one-size-fits-all specification. They will need to be unique to each individual tobacco product, and they'll need to be established for things like obviously achieving the requirement of the product itself, but then also if there are any contamination analysis that need to occur.
So the next question, if no expiration date is required, how will consumers understand whether a product is still effective? Will there be a best used by or other designation? So this is really similar, and again, Shelley, jump in here at the end. This is very similar to how they dealt with dietary supplements. So they said, you don't have to have an expiration date, but if you do have an expiration date, you have to have evidence to support it, or best used by date, whatever you want to use. But the interesting thing, and I've always said, you know, American consumers are probably some of the most sophisticated consumers in the world, and it has become common practice for consumers to look for expiration dates, best used by dates. They want to know that they're buying something that has a shelf life, usable shelf life on it. And so I think this is much of a, hey, what do you feel your consumers are going to want to see to feel comfortable buying your product? So again, if you choose to have a best used by or a expiration date, I think the FDA is going to expect that you have that data, but it is, again, not required to have an expiration date per the proposed reg. Anything to add to that, Shelley?
No, I mean, just similar with dietary supplements, if you choose not to put an expiration or best by date, you do, you know, you do run the risk of the product staying on the shelf indefinitely. It would still be expected to meet the proposed requirements in the reg as long as it was available to a consumer.
The next question is, did you discern any means by which the agency would enforce these against offshore factories that haven't been required to register? How's the FDA going to know the locations to audit if they aren't registered? I think this is an excellent question, and I don't have the answers yet. The FDA clearly has not enforced international facility registrations. It's only domestic facilities basically now. So they don't have that information. But it is clear from the proposed TPMPs that they are going to enforce this for anybody who is making product for the U.S. market, including foreign companies exporting the product to the U.S. So I think with there's more. I think there needs to be more to come here on how the FDA plans on doing this, because you're correct. Foreign facilities are not registered, so they do not have that information. They certainly have the ability to stop things at the border. but how they would know whether something was contaminated or adulterated or not manufactured under GMPs at the border, I don't know. So I don't have the answer to that, but that is definitely one of the questions that I had on how the FDA is going to approach this. So hopefully there is more to come, and maybe we'll hear something about that during the hearing in a few weeks. Do you see any differences between what's in the TPMPs and what they're expecting in a PMTA? I haven't done that type of analysis yet, but clearly what they're using the TPMPs for is to verify that whatever you submitted in your PMTA is what you're doing in the plants, in the factories, in the manufacturing of the product. So they're clearly using the TPMPs as a way to verify what has been submitted and for what you have gotten a marketing order for. You know, I think the TPMPs talk about a lot of things, a lot of detail that normally are not included in PMTAs. You know, all the detailed information about procedures and personnel and buildings and facilities. But again, using the TPMPs as a regulation to ensure you're meeting the requirements of your PMTA is really the intent. If suppliers of ingredients suppliers currently produce to GMP standard, will we have to get new statement qualifications specifically for TPMP standards? I can read this question a couple of ways. So if you are talking about that you have some sort of GMP certification from some certifying body, let's keep in mind that although the FDA may find those interesting, they rely on their own assessment of traditionally GMP compliance. You don't get a waiver or any sort of different treatment because you may have a GMP certification from somebody. These TPMPs are unique. They are different. So I don't know what GMP standard that you may have a statement or a qualification from now. But yes, I would think that if you were going to do that in the future, it would have to be specific to TPMPs because that's what the FDA is going to hold tobacco manufacturers and bulk manufacturers to.
Yeah, and Dean, if I could just, that question also asked specifically about the supplier audits. I think the FDA's expectation would be that if you're going to audit the suppliers as part of your qualification process, you would need to audit to the applicable sections of the proposed reg that would apply to that supplier. That's generally what they would expect to see in a qualification process.
What is the annualized cost for these processes for a small manufacturer starting from scratch with these requirements? There is no way for me to answer that question. If you're interested in the proposed reg, the FDA goes through a lot of assessments about what they think the impact will be to the industry and the cost of all this. But it really doesn't translate directly to what any individual company. If you think through all the things, if you have absolutely nothing in place, just as an example, you can imagine the amount of work it will take to write all these procedures and implement all these processes and policies and make sure that you have the ability to document everything that is required. It is quite a very large undertaking. It is going to take quite a bit of time if you are starting from scratch. And obviously these are just proposed, but you know what I have in my experience, though there will be some changes between proposed and final. I think a lot of these things are pretty much given. Your buildings and facilities, your personnel, your training requirements, your procedure requirements, things like that, your basic, what I call basic quality systems requirements. I don't foresee us seeing any changes in that. And so maybe you start working on those things that we don't think are going to change between the proposed and the final. Because even though the bigger companies have 2 years, The smaller companies have 6. I know for a fact many companies have been working on this for many years, and you want to give yourself as much time as possible. What are the new requirements in terms of training management? Shelley, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, they're pretty straightforward, that where there are personnel qualification requirements, and that's in a few of the subparts, that the personnel performing the actions that are needed to satisfy a requirement need to be trained. So in general, you should have a training procedure, some sort of training plan or list of training requirements that's specific to a job description or individual. And then documentation of that training. So this would be both procedural training, and I would anticipate that they will want to see some sort of training to these TPMPs. So procedure, training requirements, and then documentation of the actual training.
The next question, how can we register for the April oral hearing? Just go to the FDA website. If you just Google FDA TPMP oral hearing, I'm sure the website will come up and you can just register there. It's a, just keep in mind, if you want to comment, and I don't know, they limit that, so I don't know if they've reached their threshold yet, but you can apply to comment and speak, or you can just apply to listen. And so you can simply go to their website and sign up. It's very simple. Shelley and I have already done it. It only takes a minute. There is a question about cannabis products. I'm going to choose not to get into cannabis. This is about tobacco. This regulation applies to tobacco products, and it defines what a tobacco product is. As far as I know, this does not apply to cannabis. And so it really, I don't believe is relevant to these proposed regulations. Is there any clear direction on what testing needs to be carried out? Moisture content, heavy metals, specific allowable limits for these tests. Keep in mind, the FDA is going to either give you a marketing order or a marketing denial order based on what you submitted. So you should be telling the FDA what your specifications are, what your testing parameters are. They are not going to tell you that, and then they are going to approve or deny, basically, or allow or deny, excuse me, allow or deny your application based on what you've submitted. So it really is up to you to develop your product, design your specifications, design your limits and ranges to ensure that you are putting out a consistent product. And that's what the FDA will hold you to. If a company imports an own brand product and distributes in the U.S. market without any additional work, no relabel, who is ultimately responsible to release the product? I'm thinking of the own label production in the dietary supplement. Again, there's a whole, as you're mentioning with dietary supplements, there is a whole slew of varying relationships between contract manufacturers, own label distributors, who owns the product. I think you have to look at your situation and your relationship and decide who owns the product and who is responsible. The FDA has made it very clear on the dietary supplement side that whoever owns the product is the person responsible for releasing it. So if you are an own label distributor that literally never touches your product, it's manufactured by somebody else and then it is sent to a contract distribution warehouse and you never see the product, you are still responsible for that final product release. And I assume that is the same approach the FDA is going to take here, that it comes down to who owns the product. And Shelley has a lot of experience in supplements. So I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I mean, the only thing I would add is, at a minimum, it needs to be documented between both parties who is responsible.
So how do bulk products differ from products for further manufacturing, with the focus no longer being on finished product packaging, but rather whether the product or component is immediately usable by end consumers as is? Yeah, I mean, I think you saw the definition of bulk products. So, and I think the example is, if I sell a bulk pineapple e-liquid and a bulk strawberry flavor, and those are then further blended into a strawberry pineapple flavor, those manufacturers of the bulk product are considered tobacco manufacturers and must follow the TPMPs. So it is not just about finished marketed packaging, even though that bulk pineapple is probably not going to be sold directly to consumers. The proposed regs talks about, can it be used in its current state by consumers? And so the definition is not just about final consumer packaging. Shelley, get it? Did I get any of that wrong? I know you did.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think the question here is on target. If it's able to be used as is, regardless if they choose to further process it, if it's able to be used as is, it would be in scope.
You know, and again, folks, I've been doing this a long time with a lot of the other GMPs. It's never black and white. There's always, everybody has different situations, different setups, different corporate relationships, different organizational structures. And so the FDA's mentioned throughout the proposed regs that they're writing it in order to give the industry flexibility to adopt these regulations in a way that makes sense for their business. And so look at it from that perspective. You know, how do you want to implement the requirements that meet the intent of the TPMPs? You might do it differently as a small manufacturer than a very large manufacturer. A large manufacturer, it may have to be much more complex and sophisticated because they have multiple sites all over the world. You may be a small family-owned manufacturer somewhere in the United States, and your procedures could be much more simplified. So keep in mind that the FDA in all their GMPs rarely ever tell somebody how they have to do something specifically. They just say what has to be done, and then it is your responsibility to figure out what is the best way for you to be compliant that meets your organization and your corporate structure. So keep that in mind. And again, very rarely in GMP compliance is it always just black and white, and especially with all the different types of products we're dealing with here, all the different types of operations, and certainly all the different types of contract manufacturer type relationships. And with that, that was our last question. So again, I would like to thank everybody for joining this webinar. We are going to be doing another presentation for the TMA at their annual meeting next month, and talk a little bit more about this and what we hear in the hearing. There will be more to come. We will continue to monitor this and try to keep everybody up to date. But thank you very much for your time. I wish you all the best in complying with the TPMPs. If there's anything we can do to help, please don't hesitate to call. But I please urge everyone to get their comments in, get your thoughts, make sure your voice is heard. That's the point of the comment period, so that the TPMPs we end up with in the final rule, you know, at least have addressed everybody's questions and concerns. Shelley, any last word?
No, well said. Thank you to everybody who joined us today. Dean, I don't know if you want to show our contact information.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
But you can also find us on our EAS website if you have any questions. You know, and like Dean said, we'll continue to monitor and communicate any new information we find.
And I know we couldn't cover all the time zones, so if you have any colleagues that are in Asia or other places around the world or who just weren't available, this will be posted on our website. very quickly, and people can go there and watch this again. And then if they have any questions, they can email Shelley or I. We'd be happy to answer any questions through email. So again, thank you very much. Hope everybody has a wonderful day and take care.